Good afternoon. It is indeed a pleasure for us to share today's session with you. You've been in the field of education for any length of time at all. You have probably dealt with the question of how effective are those quizzes or exams anyway? It's strictly a moment in time, right? And so today, Jenisha Parchment is going to be sharing some ideas and thoughts with all of us about another way of really determining our students, how our students are really getting and being able to use the information. Jenisha works with us in COSI, Center for Online and Continuing Education, and comes to us as a guidance, came to us from 6 years as a guidance counselor for middle school and high school. So with that kind of a background, she can handle anything, and especially keeping us in line. So thank you, Jenisha, for being here and for sharing this with us.
Thank you, Judy, for the kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for taking your time out of your day to attend our professional development session today. All right, so here are some responses we have thus far to our question, which is, what does authentic assessment mean to you? So we have ways to measure what students can do in the real world. Someone says they're not sure what it means, which is great because you're here today. So we'll talk about what authentic assessment means. Optimally reflective means to capture degree quality of student learning with respect to learning objectives to inform both instructor and student. We have using my skills, problem solving, do they get it? Awesome, how things really work, and real world type of experiences. Great, these are all great responses. This is Robin. Robin is studying, specifically focusing on remembering the content that will be on the test. College courses generally include an assessment where students study to the test, but imagine a type of assessment where Robin has the opportunity to engage with ambiguous and complex problems similar to those in the real world. So for today's professional development session, here are our objectives. We're going to define the term authentic assessment, describe the value of authentic assessment to assess student learning, explore examples of authentic assessment in various disciplines, and then we're going to share some resources related to authentic assessment. So what exactly is authentic assessment? According to John Mueller, an instructor who uses authentic assessment a lot, it's a form of assessment in which students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. Students are asked to analyze, synthesize, and apply what they have learned in a substantial manner. Authentic assessment is often referred to as performance assessment, direct assessment, or alternative assessment. Some characteristics of authentic assessment include it simulates real-life situations. Students are asked to participate in real-world tasks and activities to show their knowledge of the subject matter. Authentic assessments usually has more than one correct answer. And this type of assessment is about showing how the student can use the knowledge from the course in real-world contexts and scenarios. Responses to this type of assessment can be evaluated using a rubric that directly connects to stated objectives or learning goals. Authentic assessment requires in-depth creativity and originality. Students must create unique solutions, which requires creativity and often out-of-the-box thinking. Authentic assessment also allows for more student choice in determining what is presented as evidence of proficiency. Some students may be better writers, test takers, presenters. Using authentic assessment, a student will have a choice in how they show you they have mastered the subject matter. And finally, authentic assessment offers a more direct evidence of application and construction of knowledge. Authentic assessment shows that not only can students remember the important facts and ideas, but they can also apply them in their field. As I was doing research preparing for this professional development session, I came across this quote from John Mueller, and I thought it was extremely important to share with you all. The quote reads, we ask students to memorize reams of information that they will rarely, if ever, use again. But we often fail to teach them the critical skills needed to meet the daily challenges of the 21st century. Skills such as information literacy, collaboration, metacognitive reflection, and self-assessment. So now we're going to talk about why we should use authentic assessment. The first is connected to the National Association of Colleges and Employers, which is also known as NACE, has developed these competencies for a career-ready workforce. NACE is one of the sources where we can find information on the employment of the college educated and forecasts of hiring and trends in the job market. NACE tracks starting salaries, recruiting and hiring practices, and student attitudes and outcomes. According to NACE, there's 8 competencies that college graduates should have to show that they are ready to join the workforce, each of which can be demonstrated in a variety of ways. I'm not going to spend too much time defining each of these competencies, but they include career and self-development, communication, critical thinking, equity and inclusion, leadership, professionalism, teamwork, and technology. Can you see some ways these NACE competencies can be connected to authentic assessment? Depending on the intended learning outcome, through authentic assessment, students will most likely have to use some of these competencies in a variety of ways. Think about how they can use communication, critical thinking, and maybe even teamwork to show they have learned the skills they need to learn and apply them in a real world situation. Then we also have Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a framework used to categorize educational goals or learning outcomes. These goals are grouped into 6 categories using an action word to describe the cognitive processes by which students encounter and work with knowledge. So think of it on a continuum of increasing complexity, going from the bottom of the triangle of remember to the top of create. By moving up the taxonomy, students become more knowledgeable, more skilled, and develop an improved understanding of the content they are learning. Think about the purpose of authentic assessment. It's to give students an opportunity to use their knowledge in situations that mimic the real world. These kinds of assessments are connected to objectives on the higher end of Bloom's taxonomy. So we're now focusing on long-term knowledge retention and transfer in comparison to memorization of knowledge. In authentic assessments, you'll ask students to create, evaluate, and analyze. These types of activities will promote higher order thinking and give students skills that can be replicated in the real world. Another reason why we should use authentic assessment is related to the Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. The UDL guidelines include, the UDL guidelines first is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. The guidelines include engagement, representation, and action and expression. An authentic assessment can connect to all 3 of these principles. For example, in the action and expression principle, is about providing students with different ways to express what they know. If we specifically look within action and expression and we think about guideline number 6, which is executive functions, students can develop and act on plans to make the most out of learning. With authentic assessment, students get to analyze the real-world problems you've given them and develop a solution. So yes, now everyone's super excited about authentic assessment because it sounds great, doesn't it? But I'm sure you've thought of some challenges related to it. And here's a few that I have that you've probably also thought of. The first is that it's new to all involved, right? It might be new to you as an instructor if you've never used this type of assessment. It's also probably going to be new to the students because it's probably not something that they're very familiar with. So in order to help them become more familiar and comfortable with this process, You'll probably need to scaffold or chunk the assessment, right? Provide clear instructions and expectations. The next is related to time, something that we don't all have a lot of, right? Authentic assessment, yes, is going to take some time and a lot of prep work to identify and or research relevant tasks to make sure those tasks are applicable to students in different areas, maybe even with different interests, and align those tasks with learning objectives and instructional materials. The biggest one I'm sure you've thought of is related to grading. You're probably asking, how do I grade this in a consistent manner? This is where the importance of a quality rubric will come in. Using a rubric that is connected to the learning goals and is clear about the knowledge that students should demonstrate is key to authentic assessment. Authentic assessment typically requires detailed, personalized, and specific feedback, meaning that as beneficial as it can be for students, it will require additional time to design and implement and provide quality feedback for. Most importantly, be kind to yourself as you're developing authentic assessment. This type of assessment is going to take some time and require revisions over time.
You also, I wanted to add in that you mentioned the opportunities of for scaffolding the assignment, and that scaffolding also could apply to the grading to give them little bits of information along the way. And then I wanted to also add something that Michelle Papania mentioned when you were talking about the NACE
Mhm.
criteria. And our Career Center offers a NACE evaluation for students, as well as information about the skills in order to include those skills into our assessments. So we can share that information when we send this out at the end.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, JD.
Mhm.
All right, so let's talk about some of the benefits of authentic assessment. The first is that it's engaging. Authentic assessment creates a direct connection between the assessment and the real world and clearly demonstrates to the student how much they've learned and where they have room to grow. It's also another opportunity for you to connect with your students. The benefits for you as an instructor include an increased awareness of what students' strengths and areas for growth are, and an opportunity to connect with each student individually based on how they have approached the task. The third is that it can be more equitable for diverse learners. So, because authentic assessments are more transparent in that there is no one correct answer, students have to justify their process and their answers. Every student has an opportunity to ask questions, to identify and use resources, and to make their case as to how their answer demonstrates their learning. And now for the good part, the great part. How could authentic assessment work in my discipline? I'm sure it's something that you have thought a little bit of. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a Padlet board. So, here are some examples of authentic assessment and how it can be used within different disciplines. What I have done is broken each kind of column down based on the college. And I've taken a look at a couple of different resources, as well as posted a couple of ideas that I have thought of based on just introductory information, introductory knowledge of what that subject area is. So if we kind of take a look at business, the College of Business, a couple of ideas that are out there. The first is to have students create an investment portfolio where students are given a portfolio and based on client situations, they must make appropriate decisions and justify the reasons for those decisions. There's also a restaurant design project, and I am a big proponent of working smarter, not necessarily harder. And so There are a lot of really great resources that are open educational resources that are available for all of us to use. And this particular one about the restaurant design project came from cteonline.org, and it's an OER research. So in this project, students are going to create the concept for an ethnic or specialty restaurant. Then they will visually define their new restaurant experience by conducting research and designing an inspiration board and brand style guide. And then they also must research effective menu design techniques and build a paper prototype of the restaurant's menu. Those are a few examples from the College of Business. From Arts and Letters, there's a particular activity where students can analyze images. And what the person who developed this resource has said students will be able to do is they will develop an awareness of historical context, develop critical thinking skills, enhance their observation and interpretive skills, and develop conceptual learning techniques.
One of the things that I do, I teach a health science elective called substance abuse. And one of the things that we talk about and I teach about in the class is about rehabilitation, rehab. Everybody has heard of rehab. So this person went to rehab, that person went to rehab. Well, what does that actually mean? So I actually do a group project and I assign each group a mock client. And in their mock write-up, it tells them what the client's presenting symptoms are and what their drug of choice is. And then they have to research the drug of choice as well as for a variety of treatment modalities. And then they actually have to write an appropriate treatment plan for that particular client in a clinic.
Wow, that's a great activity. How do you chunk that for students?
So I give them, it's a five-part project, and each student takes a part. One introduces the client, talks about the client, their presenting symptoms, educates the audience about the drug of choice. Another student diagnoses the client. They actually they actually determine which of the diagnostic criteria apply to their client, and they relate that back to my mock write-up. So in other words, they're relating the symptoms to the clinical definition of the symptoms. I have another student that assesses that comes up with the actual treatment strategies. And again, that's based on the drug of choice as well as appropriate treatment strategies that they research. I have another student evaluate their success in treatment. And then I have another student come up with the discharge summary. What would be appropriate discharge recommendations to make for this individual to ensure that they remain clean and sober? But even though they're chunked, it still requires that the students work together in order to produce a harmonious project.
Yes, that's true. And have you developed a rubric? I'd love to know about.
Yes, I absolutely. I actually came up with my own rubric that I used for grading, and I share that same rubric, so they know exactly what I'm looking for. And I have an instructional PowerPoint that I give them, and I have a very specific rubric that I grade the presentation on. And I've gotten such good feedback from students over the years because it gives them a way to actually apply what they're learning to a real world situation.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Michelle. And thank you for telling us how you chunk it as well as how you grade it, because I'm sure there are a lot of other instructors that have similar questions.
My pleasure.
Any others, Judy?
Not yet, but I have a feeling we're going to have a lot more come up. I'm looking at the names of the people and I know that many of them definitely do use some form of authentic assessment. So we're looking forward to hearing about those.
Awesome.
Again, please feel free to put a comment in the chat to put it into the Padlet, and happy to open your mic so that you can share it with us as well.
So as we're waiting for others to jump in and join the conversation, what I'd like to do is share a couple of resources. As I mentioned, I like to work smarter, not necessarily harder sometimes. And the first is from the National Center for Case Study Teaching in Science. It's the University at Buffalo, as well as for those in history and social studies. Although this particular resource is connected to K-12, I saw a lot of ways that this particular resource could be used in higher education as well. So as we're waiting, what I'd like to do is we're going to jump right back into our presentation because I have a couple of tips that I'd like to share with you. As it relates to authentic assessment, my first tip is to do a backwards design. And as instructional designers, we typically like to start with our objectives and then connect our objectives to our assessments. But if this is your first time developing any type of authentic assessment, if this is something you think you want to add to your toolbox of types of assessments, I'm really going to encourage you to start with the assessment first. So imagine what that looks like for students. How can students apply that in the real world? And as you're thinking about what that final assessment looks like, break it down. How can you chunk the assignment into smaller pieces for students? The third tip that I have is to make sure that you have a quality rubric. Rubrics are not just for you, they're for your students to know what exactly it is that you are expecting of them, as well as connecting those back to your learning outcomes or your objectives or your goals. My final tip for you is to have students reflect. It's great that they can apply that information, but that reflection piece is key for them to see what are some ways that they can grow, what have they learned through this experience of authentic assessment within your course.
To that, let me say that we've had a couple of comments in the chat regarding Dr. Dunn has said that she's been challenged trying to come up with accounting foundation accounting courses and coming up with an authentic assessment in that. And Michelle Papania made a suggestion to her. So I don't know if either of you ladies would like to have your mic open and have the discussion in real time with everyone there.
Is authentic assessment appropriate in every level of course?
So it may not be appropriate in every level, of course. You are going to have those situations where it is a foundational course. So you do have to make sure that students can do those, remember, recall, those types of things in a course. So it might not be appropriate for your course, but that is something that we can chat about if you would like to after the PD session of what maybe that could look like if we were to implement some sort of authentic assessment related to those kind of questions or what your objectives are in your course. All right, so what will be shared with you is a list of some resources that I have gathered related to the topic of authentic assessment. And this is just a short list of resources. There's so many great things that are out there and readily available for you to use to get those creative juices flowing about what kind of authentic assessments you could implement in your course. Remember, authentic assessment is just one tool in the toolbox of many types of assessments that you can use within your course. And as I said earlier, I'd be happier to connect with you. And as Kim has said, you might be using some authentic assessment already in your course. Sometimes it's just about taking a deeper look at what the assessment is and how you can apply it within your course and for your students.
So, Jenisha, you have put so much work and effort into this. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate what you have shared and how beautifully you shared it. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for taking the time today to join us. Thank you.